maybe this will invigorate you.
Okay.
This topic.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Well, I've been really I've been hesitating to bring this up, which is the whole war in Iran.
Mm.
But and part of that has been because we were kind of, we've been moving through the later parts of Lent and then the early parts of Easter, and I really wanted to stay focused on spiritual, really spiritual topics for the season. And I also when it comes to events like this, I like to just sit, wait, and watch.
Okay.
And I don't, everybody likes to jump
Oh,
in
yeah.
and make all their commentaries,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody has an opinion. And most of the time, in those early stages, we really don't understand enough. We don't know enough of what's going on. Even the people that call themselves experts,
Yeah.
I think are often jumping the gun. And there's lots of reasons. People want to
I
get
think everybody
clicks
just
and
wants
likes
to be
and
heard.
yeah. I mean, everybody wants to get into the fray and make their commentaries, and so I hesitate. But and I don't. I want to talk about this not so much from the perspective of, geopolitics, although, I have things to say about some of those things, but just like as a Catholic, how are we supposed to think through what we know
Mm-hmm.
and what we're seeing as American Catholics, but also when our country is doing something that seems to be at odds with what Rome is saying, and how do you navigate that in good conscience?
Oh, that's good.
So
That's interesting to me.
oh, is that
Yeah.
better than the coffee?
Way to
then?
go.
Oh, good. Yeah. So that's
I
kind of what I want to
yeah,
try to
yeah.
tackle today.
I'm just going to be, brutally honest. I don't really follow it. I don't know why. I think I'm just so limited in my what I consume, and that's always sort of the last on my list. So all I know, and I don't know. Maybe I'm in the same boat as a lot of run-of-the-mill Catholics, but all I know is that we don't we don't like the leadership that was in there because they pose some sort of threat to Israel, to the interests of the United States. So we took them out, took out the leadership, and then, from what I understand, there was a new leader that came in, and we also tried to eliminate that leader, but we're not sure whether or not he's dead. And so there's still this, it's like smacking the hornet's nest, and so there's still all this buzzing going on, like it hasn't. In other words, nothing has really been resolved. But from the sort of headlines, it seems like we're trying to have some sort of talks between us and them to come to. As you can see, there's a thread of ignorance that runs through
for
this.
being such an ignoramus, you're actually doing pretty good. You have a pretty good handle.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
you
we're
get
trying to
you
reach
have
a
the
place.
basic sketch of
Okay,
the situation,
that's
and we've dealt a pretty deadly blow to all of their military, installations and
Now,
assets. So
yeah.
so they're pretty let's say they're pretty dug in and pretty pretty they're pretty dug in and pretty buried.
Yeah.
But the question then is where are we going from here? That's where we are in the international conversation. What's next?
Yeah.
And we just announced that we're putting a naval blockade on the Gulf so that nothing can get in or out. So that's going to obviously put a major squeeze on Iran's revenue, and it's also going to create a lot of problems for everybody that needs oil coming out of the Gulf.
Yeah.
So that's going to really force the international community to step up and get involved in the situation and hopefully apply pressure to Iran.
Now, can I ask a question? Are we the narrative always seems like it's controlled by somebody, Is it true that at the heart of it, it is all about Iran's nuclear potential, and they're constantly, it's like terrorism is at the heart of what they're supporting. And I mean, is that really what, like,
Yeah, I think, well, what the narrative has been for a long time, that they're the number one state-sponsored terrorist group, I
okay,
mean country, that is, they're the ones that are sponsoring and funding all of the terrorist groups around, around the Middle East,
yeah,
and I think that's true. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. And that they have been working very hard. They're a relatively powerful army, and they're one of the bigger militaries. They were, I should say. They're not anymore, but they
okay,
were. And they've been working pretty hard and doggedly to get a nuclear missile. And we and our allies have said all along, the answer is no, because their rhetoric seems to be that we intend to use that,
yeah,
because we want to destroy America and we want to destroy Israel. And so our position has been, you will never get a nuclear, you'll never get nuclear capability, at least militarily. There's
yeah,
been lots of talk back and forth about using nuclear for energy, but of course, when you sit on one of the largest oil reserves in the country, one wonders why one needs that. So there's that. So that's what's going on. And of course, in previous administrations, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of negotiations, but not a lot of response on their side. They just keep going forward with their plan. So last summer, we bombed all of their nuclear, sites, their development sites,
yeah,
pretty hard, and then they kept going. They kept trying to move forward, so we just decided to go in and just level their military and there's been lots of questions about, well, are we in for regime change? Are we going to put boots on the ground? There's been all these kinds of questions, which I'm not like, should we put boots on the ground? It's not my expertise, on a tactical level to even comment on such things like that.
yeah,
I can look at past situations we've been in and say, well, it never works out very well
right,
when you go and try to become an occupying force that tries to bring peace to a population of people that don't necessarily want what you are bringing.
at least not the leaders.
Yeah, I mean, that's what happened in, to some extent in Korea, in Vietnam,
yeah, yeah,
Iraq, Afghanistan. It's like it just doesn't seem to work. So, what we're seeing and what we've been hearing from the Trump administration is that this is different, and it's different so far. But at the end of the day, if you don't get the people that are in power out of power and provide an opportunity for someone else who's more reasonable in power, then what are you left with? You're left with basically, cutting and getting out
yeah,
and leaving the existing regime now, like the Hornets. That was
yeah,
good. That was a good analogy. Like super, resentful and ready to, do everything they can to get back at us.
yeah,
So now we have a different type of perpetual problem. Or you create the conditions somehow to get a new government in there, and there seems to be a lot of sympathy inside the country for a more moderate government.
yeah,
I hear the statistic, like 80% of the people want a more moderate government and don't like the Ayatollahs and so on. And I
yeah,
think that's probably true as well. So it's just the what I wanted to kind of like try to wrestle with, I guess the point of entry for me in this conversation is what do you do in a world where you have people that really seem to have their wills bent on very destructive action towards others.
yeah,
And we, as Christian people, are always told and compelled to say, we have to seek a diplomatic means, we have to seek dialogue. And it's, you hear that, coming from the Vatican as if that's the only moral option.
Yeah.
And I think where, as a moral theologian, I think that where it gets gray and messy is in how you apply the just war doctrine in contemporary situations and circumstances with modern warfare, with the kinds of capabilities that countries have.
Right.
And I think that it's complicated because the criteria, in my opinion, need to be updated to reflect the reality that we have to face today, rather than an articulation of the just war theory that was very applicable in the medieval times, when it was first formulated by Aquinas.
Things have changed since then.
Just a little bit, I mean, what's ironic is very recently with the way Russia moved into Ukraine, you had the very kind of medieval kind of circumstances where you have army mobilizing and lining up on the border, and so you have a clear signal of a preemptive strike on your country, so you're allowed to employ defense. And everybody, the international community, has pretty almost universally been on the side of Ukraine for this because it's so obvious. What's difficult when you're dealing with terrorism is, first of all, the entities that are attacking you are not clear international bodies.
Right.
They're being sponsored by an international body. So what do you do with that? And then on top of that, you're dealing with when you're dealing with terrorism, you're dealing with little micro attacks. So we've been hearing in the news a lot, for the last 49 years, or call it 50 years, just to round it up here, we've been dealing with a regime that's just been taking pot shots at the United States, and we've lost some thousands of soldiers through these little terrorist attacks. On the grand scheme of things, that's pretty minimal in terms of the loss of life. And so people ask, well, is our response to that proportionate? And, the problem is it's the issue of things like, dirty bombs and, what if a terrorist group got, a nuclear bomb? Or what do you do if a terrorist group got a hold of biological weaponry that would allow them to, say, fly in a little single, engined Cessna and drop a biological weapon on top of a major city around the world, and suddenly you've got hundreds of thousands of people that are dying of or dead from some kind of a infection, or you think about so we just live in a different world now. And so the question of preemptive strike, at what point in time do you discern that an enemy is attacking you? What does attack mean? These are all the kind of questions. And I think that I saw one article recently from a Catholic commentator, more on the left of things, arguing, is there such a thing as just war in modern warfare? And as a Thomist, I would say absolutely there is, because we always have the right to self-defense. But the question is at what point in time can we adequately discern that we should be able to defend ourselves against an eventual attack? And that's, to be honest with you, it's hard for me, even as much reading as I've done on this, to make a definitive judgment that what we did was right, because what I know is only based upon what our government is willing to say, and even the experts and the insiders that have real intelligence, so to speak. I mean, there's lots of people that claim that they have inside, intelligence on what's really going on. I'm increasingly skeptical because their predictions seem to be so wrong most of the time. But the question is how imminent and how real was the threat of, when you hear Trump say they were 2 weeks away from having, enough enriched uranium to be able to put it into a missile and launch it somewhere. I remember in Iraq hearing about, Saddam Hussein was making weapons of mass destruction, and as it turns out, it was kind of He really wasn't.
Yeah.
And it turns out that there were other agendas. We were justifying going in and doing what we were doing to reconfigure the geopolitical balance of power in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And whether there's good or bad reasons to do that, it was just it wasn't what they told us. So it's hard, to say, well, have they been really an imminent threat? My inclination is to say, I think that threat is pretty real.
Mm-hmm.
I think Iran has both spoken and acted in such a way that they are in a perpetual state of warring against us in the ways in which they feel they can get away with it.
Yeah.
And at what point in time, I mean, if someone just keeps, if someone comes up to you with a knife and keeps slashing you, and well, that's not a mortal blow, then they slash your leg. Well, that's
Mm-hmm.
not a mortal blow.
Right.
Then they slash your cheekbone. Well, that's not a mortal blow. If a country keeps doing that, at what point in time do you say, okay, enough is enough?
Well, okay. Man, you sort of answered some of my questions, or at least like the direction that I think is really interesting to me is that first and foremost, that question, like at what point, because it's hard, you know, the regular Catholic has so much going on, and I've in their life, and I feel like this is something that should at least be on the radar of people's, like, is this right or is this wrong? Admittedly, I just kind of I sort of back off of that question and just say, I have a certain, this is probably so naive and stupid, but I have a certain level of trust that things are being handled, to some degree, like properly. But you're right. Like our government has oftentimes in the past done things that then in the end are like, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't really like what you're saying it was. Like there was a whole other agenda. So, which causes me to sort of, that's why I back off. I'm like, how would I ever know? Like, how do you ever know what information to trust? Who's telling the true story in this? And so then it's like, well, how am I supposed to feel about it? It seems like the Vatican, if I'm correct on this, like they always seem to go the route of like, no, you shouldn't be aggressive. You should be like trying diplomacy, like talking with them. But I feel like the reality is some governments, some leaderships are just not open to that, right? And so it's like you're saying, they're just like when everybody's looking the other way, they're kind of slicing you little by little. And so at some point you feel like I can't take this anymore. But like what's the proper response? Is the proper response to, just go in and I don't know.
Right. It's tough to know. And so all I can offer you is my best educated perspective.
Yeah.
I don't want to call it an opinion because I'm not sure everything that I'm saying is just my opinion.
Sure.
I think there's some things that I can say, that are either a matter of fact or they're a matter of principle and a principle justified within our tradition. But some things are a matter of opinion because I can't know with certainty, and none of us really can.
Yeah.
So you just have to watch closely and then kind of look at the big picture and say, okay, well, what does prudence dictate here? How do we discern what the best course of action is? And it's tough. I mean, there's a number of things that I want to get into in sort of unpacking this. So let's start with this in response to what you just said, which is I think it's okay to acknowledge that the United States government and the Vatican have a different purview that don't necessarily have to be perfectly aligned, because the Vatican isn't responsible, for defending the legitimate interests of the United States of America. And it's not the United States of America's responsibility to, necessarily prioritize the interests of the Vatican. We have different purviews and different areas of responsibility that I think are very different. They overlap, and of course, we have to abide by the same moral principles, but we have different spheres of responsibility, and so we're going to not always necessarily agree, especially when it comes to matters of prudential judgment. The Vatican is always going to side with peace.
Yeah.
And it's always going to side with diplomacy and dialogue and things like this, because from the church's perspective, that's the greatest avenue for peace in the world, and it is. It's just not always possible. And it's not up to the church to decide on behalf of other nations when it's possible and when it's not possible.
Right.
The church's position is always a prophetic one. So the church is always going to hold up the highest standard and the highest ideal and the greatest promise of peace.
Yeah.
So like you look at this weekend, she could say to Iran, you have just as much of an obligation to come to the table and negotiate a peace with the United States and to commit yourself to the path of peace by not sponsoring terrorism anymore, by not holding the world hostage in the Straits of Hormuz or whatever.
Did the church say that?
No, the church doesn't. But see, the church typically isn't going to side with this or that side. She's going to side with peace and then say, you all need to figure it out. Here's the standard. You figure it out. The only grievance that I can have sometimes with Rome's position is that where is the church's teaching on self-defense? And we're not generous enough with the necessity of that principle. So, what do you do? If I was a diplomat, either to the Holy See, or I was I was an ambassador of the Vatican to a nation, I would be asking this question, like just war theory is based in the principle of self-defense. So at what point in time do you not allow certain players in the world to get enough power to be able to do some real destructive damage? There's a preemptive way in which you might need to act so that bad actors don't get to the point where now it's way more difficult to stop them and the stakes are way higher. This is what happened during World War II. We let things go too long.
Yeah.
And the same thing, the same thing with the Soviet Union. It's like we let communism gain way too much of a foothold in the world, and we could have acted sooner and prevented it from becoming such a force to contend with.
So I'm gonna ask.
But we were conservative in that and didn't.
Okay, so this is totally your opinion. Why do you think the church avoids getting into that?
Well, I think because the church doesn't ever want to appear to be siding with a particular nation, because she is, you could say, the mother of all nations, in the sense that she has a responsibility to provide for the spiritual well-being of the entire human race. So when she takes a particular stand, it's a kind of crossing over a line. The only time that the church is, she might. Well, I'll say something else in just a second, but let me finish this thought and I'll come back to it. But that is to say that when the church, is being attacked directly, she'll speak out, because she's also an international body. The Vatican is a city-state. It has international status and is a member state of the United Nations. So when she's attacked, she would call out that enemy. And of course, a lot of times international entities are hesitant to do that because now you're invoking an international presence, you know. So it's interesting because she'll denounce the violence, for example, in Nigeria when Catholics are being attacked by Muslims.
Right.
She'll denounce the violence of terrorism and things like that, but doesn't, she's going to work these peace processes behind closed doors, mostly in her own diplomatic way. But when the church takes a stand publicly against one entity or another, which I think she seldom does, it just complicates the church's relationship to all of the nations. So
the church would never ultimately kind of take a hard stand on you're right, you're wrong.
It would take a hard stance on these are the actions which are permittable.
Yeah.
These are the actions which are not.
Yeah.
So this situation is very complicated, and so what you hear is the Vatican making appeals to peace and diplomacy and condemning violence in this, very general sense of, look, violence it's not ultimately going to resolve the issue. And historical memory would serve us well in saying, yeah, a lot of times it doesn't. It just doesn't, because if you don't completely annihilate your enemy, you still have to deal with them. And now they're that much more resentful.
Yeah.
So that's what's complicated in this situation with Iran, is because we are now in a position where we have to, quote unquote, finish the job if we're going to actually have any hope of there being a stable peace with the nation of Iran. And that means that they have to have a different government. Well, when you start getting into regime change, you get into a very complicated kind of situation where you're like, well, who has the rights to do that? And how much does the international community need to do that, get involved in that process? Can you do that unilaterally with one nation state, telling another nation? In the United States of America, it can get away with this because we're the most powerful nation in the world, and nobody has a real defense against us. So it gets complicated in the sense that we have to make sure that our cause is really is right, not just for us, but for the wider international community. And that's what makes it's difficult to be the Monday night armchair quarterback in this situation, because it's like it's all based upon what our government is actually sharing with us. And, so if you take what they're saying on face value, that this is a real threat, not just to the United States, but to Europe and to the Middle East, then by all means, this was a just action. We needed to stop them before things escalated to a point where it becomes much more difficult to stop something really evil and horrible from happening.
Yeah.
So so I think if you're arguing in good faith, and this is where it's like, yeah, the church's teaching on self-defense justifies this, and maybe it's worthwhile actually unpacking what that that theory is. But
the self-defense one.
Self-defense and just war, just for the sake of our audience, maybe it's worthwhile unpacking that a little bit.
Yeah, I remember. This is just making me think of a time whenever I was in I don't know, elementary school, early middle school, and there was a group of kids that like the classic bullying type experience, and so I remember one time, I may have shared this story before, but going to confession, to our parish priest, and I was telling him about the situation, and he said, "Oh, you absolutely have the right to fight back and defend yourself," which I was like, I never would have thought that the priest would have said that. But, as the story unfolds, I did. And the bullying stopped immediately, because it was like, it was sort of the same thing you're telling, where it's like when nobody's looking, people have a tendency to to do, to exercise whatever it is, their anger, their angst, their whatever's motivating them to do something, evil or bad or hurtful to somebody else. But then typically when somebody stands up to it and says like, okay, that's enough, then they kind of
It
like
stops.
back off.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's difficult just to know where that, like when the violent reaction is justified. Like at what point do you take it and then you make the choice of like, okay, this is the line that's been crossed.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. One has to discern that in the actual reality of it. Like you can't make that judgment in the abstract, because and this is where, whenever we look at any moral action, and you can look at a moral action as a singular act or as a collection of actions, towards a particular end, you have to look at what's the end that we're aiming for, what's the means by which we're aiming at that end, and what are the circumstances within which we're discerning whether to act or not.
Mm-hmm.
And all of those things have to be taken into consideration. So in this situation, the assumption is we're looking for a more stable peace and stability, you would say, in the Middle East for the sake of the entire international community, because quite frankly, everybody's sick and tired of it. And there just isn't a good reason. Like, Islamic nations that have chosen to play in the sandbox of the world community are doing fine.
Yeah, right.
They live their faith faithfully. They participate in the modern world economy. They're democratic institutions, and currently they're actually aligning themselves with us in this cause because they're, quite frankly, sick and tired of Iran too. So can the world tolerate this kind of radicalized fundamentalist Islamicism, which is an ideology? It's not a legitimate expression, in my opinion. It's not a legitimate expression of true religion, because no true religion can justify forcing submission to religious conviction at the end, at the barrel of a gun, or at a knife at your throat. Like, that's just not acceptable by any standard, religious or philosophically, like in terms of religion, in terms of natural law. Like, you just can't justify it. Terrorism is not acceptable. Forced conversions. Look at all the people that the Iranian government, their own people, that they've killed. This athlete that was just, killed. Sorry, but from a Catholic perspective, it's not a true religion. You cannot justify that. But there are plenty. I mean, there are millions of Muslims that live around the world that wouldn't subscribe to that or wouldn't embrace that.
Yeah.
They might not renounce it. And I think the reason for that is because they are, quite frankly, just afraid of being attacked themselves by these terrorist groups.
Okay.
So they keep their quiet. And maybe that we could say that's cowardly, but look, would Christians do it would we be any better under those circumstances? If I thought someone was going to blow my house up, my Christian neighbor, would I speak out? I don't know. Let's be fair to these people. Like, you say, well, why aren't the Iranian people taking to the streets? They don't have any arms. They're just going to get slaughtered. They tried to some months ago, and they killed 40,000 people. So there's just no place in the world for that kind of thing, and it has to be eradicated. And the question is can you diplomatically, or can you dialogue to a peace settlement with people who think that way?
Right.
And
right.
I'm a realist.
Yeah.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
These people, I really don't even think it's that they're reasonable people that just have some bad ideas. I think they're people that are so ideologically deranged that they can't see the error of their ways. And if people that are willing to kill themselves to kill other people, you can't reason with people like that. So what are you going to do under those circumstances when they keep attaining greater and greater military power?
So, okay, I want to go back because I have a question. I want to go back to the example of the bullying example. Let's say in a particular situation, you're overhearing conversation that group of people are having that is threatening. Like it's a threatening kind of conversation. Like they're talking about their desire to beat the crap out of you. They don't. There's not like a whole. They don't just come up and start pummeling you, but there's like little hints of it. Like maybe they come up and they smack your books out of your hand or whatever. Like, is there such a thing as like a preemptive self-defense? In other words, like, can you actually, based on your perceived threat, do something about it? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like, or
I do.
do you have to wait to kind of experience the sort of attack before you're allowed to quote unquote self-defend?
Well, I mean, again, it depends. It depends on the actual circumstances and what you're really up against and dealing with. So, first of all, I would make a really critical distinction between people who might be talking about stuff versus actually preparing themselves. So, let's say, for example, you hear a kid, you know, talking in their little group chat with friends about wanting to, kill their friends, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thousands and thousands of kids probably use a lot of hyperbolic speech. I want to kill them. They just, they made fun of me at
Yeah.
school and I just want to kill them. And you're like, okay, whatever. Okay,
Mhm.
but if the police or the FBI suddenly realize that a person who's talking like that is starting to stockpile, assault rifles,
Mhm.
okay, they seem to be acting in a way which is leading to a carrying out of their action.
Yeah.
I think you would say, well, first of all, you would keep a very close eye on them, and the second they made even a twitch of a move towards something, yes, you would go in there and you would stop that person from doing that. And that's what our counter and our intelligence agencies are
right.
doing with counterterrorism moves all the time. We're not waiting until
Yeah.
they just blew up a subway, so I guess we can do something about it. Now
Right.
they're trying to prevent this from happening. So when you're dealing with a state, an entire nation state that's behind stuff like this, and they have all these little terrorist cell groups out there that are quite organized, and they're not just talking, they're planning, they're organizing, and they're
Yeah.
carrying out, and they've been doing it consistently for decades. I think you have every right. See, I think the problem is that the United States government and our allies have not been willing to do what's necessary to stop it. We've been talking about the war on terror, but we've tried things. It hasn't gotten the job done.
Yeah.
So you keep, I think Trump has decided, okay, now I'm not saying that what Trump's doing is going to work. I'm not saying that Trump's got the right solution. I don't know. It's like a wait and see.
Mm-hmm.
But he seems to be taking more formidable steps to eradicate the problem. And this is what you see with the way he's dealing with the border, with what he did with Venezuela, with what he's doing with the drug cartels too, which is another example. We've been fighting this war on drugs for a long time, but it doesn't look like a war to me. It looks like a lot of rhetoric and not a lot of backing, not a lot of teeth.
A couple of things that, just the idea of self-defense, which is not really like it's always sort of in the background, especially when the church never. It seems like the church never comes out with a statement of something to the effect of, well, nations do have the right to self-defense, because it seems like they're always going towards the ideal, which is, let's assume that that everybody wants to get along and come to the table and work it all out. And but you're right. Like, the truth is, and this seems to be the case since all of history, is that there just are some people who are not reasonable people. I mean, you could take that from this international kind of setting that we're talking about all the way down into like your communities, or like between, even within families, like there can be people who just aren't willing to come to the table in good faith and try to work things out for whatever reason, like so I think this idea of self-defense, I think it just gets tricky in that gray area. Like when is it a good use of self-defense, or when have we said it's in self-defense, but we're actually really just interested in something else, like, and that, how do you ever know that? I think that's up to an individual or a nation to discern that properly. And that's going back to my thing, is like I struggle because I want to trust that we're discerning these things properly, but there's always that ugliness of the reality that we're always scheming. We're always, it seems like we're always trying to skirt the rules in different ways.
Yeah.
So, but I do think that the idea of self-defense is an important one it's never discussed. I also found it really interesting when you talked about, like, in our modern time, we don't have the stomach. I think you use, like, we don't have the stomach for this idea of using sort of conflicts to to um, to engage in real conflict because of how ugly it's been. It seems like we definitely, at least in the United States, have more people seem to have this aversion to doing these kinds of things because they.
Well, we've lived in the United States with a lot of peace and security,
Yeah, right.
and I think this raises like a really important question, which is, I think it's hard for the international community and also the Vatican to advocate for the United States' right to defense when it's the most, like, far and away the most powerful country in the world. And the argument is complicated because there have been people who, as Americans, you could say, have taken advantage and exploited our advantage in the world in this very difficult, standoff we've been facing since World War II. And this, by the way, just as an aside, I don't want to get too distracted with this, but that's the real story of Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was a guy who was laundering the money that and creating the sort of like underground connections and networks that was helping us fight the Cold War. And then, of course, as the geopolitical landscape changed, the cause changed slightly, but he becomes, sort of a quiet secret agent, not an official agent, not like a spy, but a guy who's in the business of moving money around in the global economy for the sake of, helping the cause of the, Western allies. And if you're on the other end of that, you could see how other countries would grow in their resentment. And so what's complicated is that the United States has kind of, sort of like the Pax Romana of the ancient world with the Roman Empire. The United States has always found itself in this position where it's funding, it's defending, it's providing the industrial basis, the stability of the marketplace, the world the world currency. Like, we provide the world with so much of the context that allows anything good in the world to happen. And then what happens is the United States starts suffering, negative effects of being overextended while everybody expects us to keep doing this, but they're not stepping up to the plate to do their fair share. This is what's happened with Europe. I mean, Europe has lived at the luxury of the United States military and economic system and the strength of the dollar for a long time. And at one point in time, it's like, do you say, okay, enough is enough? Like, if you want to have a say in all of this, well, then step up and contribute something to the overall situation. Well, the reality is they're not in much of a position to do that anymore because they've become so dependent on us. Or another thing I would say, it's like, you look around, you say, well, all these poor people and all these other nations, look at how they suffer and they just never get a chance to participate in the world economy.
Mm-hmm.
And so you look at the United States and you say, well, it must be because we're the most powerful nation in the world, it must be our fault. Because we're powerful and therefore de facto, this, by the way, is a very Marxist analysis of way of seeing it. Well, if the United States is powerful, they're powerful at the expense of all these other poor countries, and therefore we're the oppressor and the exploitive, party here, and everybody else is the victim. And it's like that kind of narrative really drives me crazy, and sometimes I feel like certain spokespeople inside the church kind of share that view of things. It's like, well, how come these countries are never held accountable? Their governments.
Yeah.
Their governments are not favorable to democratic institutions. Even when they have the backing of the United States, they still don't practice democratic.
Yeah.
They don't practice democracy and representative government and free markets, and they don't secure property rights, and they don't have the rule of law. And so their people suffer. And then somehow it's hard because you might have some individual Americans who go into a situation like that and take advantage of it. But that's not necessarily the position of the United States government. It's like it's just a shrewd businessman who wants to go in and become a billionaire because he can take advantage of a weaker market.
So why doesn't the church publicly put more pressure or expectation on governments that are, everybody knows they're a corrupt government and it's hurting their people?
Well, historically, the way the church has always done that, again, that goes back to the earlier point I made. The church isn't generally in the business, there's some exceptions, but of calling out a particular nation. The church's role is to prophetically speak to all the nations, and that's what Catholic social teaching does. Every nation is going to be held accountable to the moral criteria of peace and justice. And therefore, every government is responsible to the principles laid out in Catholic social teaching. But the problem is sometimes that plays out like a kind of a moral platitude. It's like, so the deeper question is how do we get, countries around the world that are, in third and second world status to a place where they're actually fully participating? Well, they have to have the rule of law. They have to have democratic, institutions. They need to safeguard, property rights, and they need to do stuff like that because then their people will be able to have a fair shot at improving their lives and all of that. So
okay, but in this particular situation, the church is very vocal about, well, you just need to, talk, come to peaceful terms through talks. But the church isn't saying, oh, and also let's remind you that, governments that are, all governments that are, I don't know how they would word it, but governments that suck, where there's leaders who are clearly doing things that are hurting the lives of their people. Like that is also not it's not acceptable. Like it's not a way to live. It's not a way to govern. It's
right, and the church the church has condemned terrorism, and terrorist acts, many, many times. Again, we probably get more airtime because we're the world superpower.
Yeah.
And the church wants us to exercise as much constraint as we possibly can. And again, in my opinion, we've been incredibly constrained. I think there's been very, very few civilian casualties that were our fault. I mean, we've really targeted all their military, assets and been very restrained and accurate at a level that's amazing just on a purely technological level. It's like the fact that we can even do what we do is incredible.
Yeah.
But the fact that we actually do it that way, I think it's interesting where it's like, we're very precise in what we target. Meanwhile, Iran's been just throwing bombs up into civilian populations, again, acting as a terrorist state, because that's clearly against international law, targeting, civilian populations and,
Yeah. Yeah.
and doing all that. So it's, again, there's been threats coming out of the White House about, taking out their infrastructure, which would do irreparable harm to the population of Iran. And I don't think Trump wants to do that. But the question is how far do you have to go to get this regime to yield? They just won't. And this raises another kind of question where it's like, and this is, for me, this is the real moral quandary, because I don't honestly have an answer, but this is how I frame it. It's like, the left in this country wants to use diplomacy and dialogue. And I'm like, yeah, but you can't dialogue with these people. They have no interest. But on the other hand, the right seems to feel that we can find a purely military solution to this if we just beat them, back militarily. But the problem is like, how are you going to root out the hundreds of thousands of people in this country that are sympathetic to this regime without boots on the ground, without sending your military in and being an occupying force? I just don't have an answer to that question. I don't know. And I'm not very confident that we can, unless somehow inside of Iran, the people in there are able to take over their government. We tried it in Iraq and it failed miserably.
Well, it seems to me that the only way that that's going to happen is if you have a critical mass of people who are 100% bought into the idea of a particular government structure. So in other words, willing to die because they know that that is the best thing. I feel like that's where the breakdown happens. I feel like you have these, the initial response from some people is like, yeah, this is a great idea, but then, are they really willing to die for it? That to me seems like that's where the change would happen. It's just, you have to have.
Yeah, my son Isaac was saying to me, he's like, Dad, like the only way that I can see this being resolved is through civil war, and that's terrible. But and the right side of that has to win that, and so that's what makes this complicated. Is there isn't we oftentimes don't find ourselves in a situation where we can choose the ideal. We have to live within the reality and choose the best option that we have. And kicking the can down the street doesn't seem like a good option with a regime like this that's aggressively pursuing a nuclear weapon and telling us in the world they're going to use it. Like, I just don't. It's, people often compare to North Korea, and I'm like, North Korea, Asian cultures, like, you're just dealing with an entirely different reality. It is not in their self-interest. They just want the security of having a nuclear weapon to be left alone. I don't think that that's the case in Iran. I think anybody with any sense who's been watching what's gone on the last 50 years could reasonably say that without being completely naive. So you have to deal with the very real prospect that they'll use it. And what are we going to say then? Like, oh, they drop a bomb on Tel Aviv and we just sat by and watched the second Jewish Holocaust. Do we really want that? And I think that is a very real possibility. So it's very sobering and it's very hard, and that's why it's like, I'm glad I'm not the one who has to make these decisions, and I'm reticent and hesitant to speak too emphatically in one direction or another. The best that I can do right now is just try to sift through the mess of it and hope and pray that our leaders are doing what's necessary for the greater good and restraining themselves as much as they can reasonably permit doing so that they don't cross that line beyond which we could never justify what they're doing. And I'm praying that, there can be, something gives and reasonable people will come to the table with enough pressure, and they can spare the population of Iran, because it's clear that most of those people don't like their regime and they want a new one, but don't know how to get that for themselves without a major bloodbath. So at any rate, gosh, there's just so much that we could we could say about all this. But I hope that this has been, I hope it's been helpful to you and to the people listening, at least to try to, get some lay of the land.
Yeah, definitely better. I don't engage in a lot of conversations about it. So anytime I do, and there's some very particular things that I'll take to heart in this. So thanks, man.
Yeah. Well, I hope this was helpful. It's a very messy and complicated world out there, and there's what I like to say, a lot of mixture of light and darkness. And as Christian people, we always have to lean in on the church's teaching, the entire breadth and spectrum of that teaching. But even more importantly, I think we need to really pray and pray that God can intervene, because the reality is that there are many evils in this world that only God can address directly through what might be called just a miracle of grace. So it seems like both in Russia and Ukraine and also in the Middle East, we need such a miracle. We just need sober and peaceful minds to prevail in this situation, and for the evil and the destruction and the violence that is threatening peace and civilization can somehow be brought to an end by God's gracious hand. So happy Easter, and let us continue to pray for the peace of the risen Lord in our dark and troubled world today.
See ya.
The Wise Guys podcast is a production of Preambula Group, a Catholic ministry dedicated to helping you thrive in the heart of Jesus. Visit us on the web at preambula.org and follow us on social media.